My name is Adam Wells, and I've always been skeptical of ghost stories, curses, and anything that couldn't be explained by reason or science. At least I was. What happened to me 5 years ago changed that forever. I've tried to forget it, to rationalize it, but no matter how much time passes, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. It all started with a letter. I was working as a freelance journalist back then, taking any story that paid the bills. Most of my assignments were mundane, local human interest pieces, small-town events, the occasional fluff about some quirky old-timer. But one day, I got an anonymous letter in the mail. It was handwritten in neat, looping cursive on aged, yellowing. "Blackwood is dying. We need someone to tell the truth. Come alone." The return address was from Blackwood, a small town tucked deep in the Adirondack Mountains. I'd never heard of it before. A quick search online revealed almost nothing about the place. No website, no news articles, not even a Wikipedia page. Just a single map result showing it existed. Barely. I should have ignored it. But the journalist in me was intrigued. Who sent the letter? Why were they so desperate? The mystery was too tempting to pass up. So the next morning, I packed my bag, loaded my car, and set out for Blackwood. The drive was long, winding through dense forests and narrow, crumbling roads. My GPS gave up about an hour before I reached the town, leaving me to navigate using nothing but the crude directions I jotted down from the map. When I finally arrived, it was late afternoon, and the sun was already sinking low behind the trees. Blackwood was small, smaller than I'd imagined. The entire town consisted of a single street, lined with old, sagging buildings. The paint on most of them had faded to gray, and many looked abandoned. There was a gas station, a diner, a general store, and a church whose steeple leaned precariously to one side. As I parked my car and stepped out, I was struck by the eerie silence. No voices, no laughter, not even the distant hum of cars. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the creak of a weathered sign swinging in the breeze. The sign read, "Welcome to Blackwood, population 89. I couldn't help but notice that the 89 had been crossed out, and someone had written 78 beneath it in thick black paint. I walked into the diner first, hoping to find someone who could tell me more about the town, or at least point me to whoever sent the letter. Inside, a handful of people sat at the counter and in the booths, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes sunken. They all turned to look at me as I entered, and the air seemed to grow heavier. "Help you, stranger?" asked the man behind the counter. He was tall and thin, his voice scratchy, like he hadn't spoken much lately. "Yeah, I'm looking for someone," I said, pulling out the letter. "I got this, and I—" The moment he saw the paper, his expression darkened. He glanced around the diner, then leaned in close. "You need to leave," he whispered. "Go now, while you still can." What? Why? Before he could answer, a woman sitting near the window stood up. She was in her 52nd, with wild gray hair and a face lined with worry. "You're here because of the shadows, aren't you?" she said, her voice trembling. "Shadows?" I asked, confused. The man behind the counter grabbed my arm. "Don't listen to her, just—" But I couldn't leave, not yet. "I just want to know what's going on here," I said. "What are you all so afraid of?" Before anyone could respond, the bell above the diner's door jingled, and a new figure stepped inside. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a sheriff's uniform that looked as old as the town itself. He had a weathered face and cold gray eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "What's going on here?" the sheriff asked, his voice low and even. "Nothing," the man behind the counter said quickly, releasing my arm. "Just telling the stranger he's got the wrong plate." The sheriff's gaze lingered on me. "Is that so?" I nodded, suddenly uneasy. "Yeah, sorry for the trouble. I left the diner and got back in my car, but I didn't leave. Not yet." I parked on the side of the road and decided to explore the town a bit more. Something about the way everyone had acted didn't sit right with me. They were scared, terrified even. But of what? As I walked down the street, the shadows from the surrounding forest seemed to stretch unnaturally far, creeping across the ground like fingers. The further I went, the colder the air became. Eventually, I found myself standing outside the church. Its doors were ajar, and something about it drew me in. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. The interior was dark and smelled of damp wood and decay. At the front of the church, an old man knelt, his head bowed in prayer. He didn't look up as I approached, but his voice was barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "I got a letter," I began, but he cut me off. "They sent it," he said. "They always send it when they're—" "Who's they?" I asked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he stood and turned to face me. His eyes were clouded, his face pale as death. "They're in the shadows," he said. "They've always been here, waiting, watching. The town belongs to them now. We're just their cattle." I took a step back, my heart racing. "This is insane." "You'll see," he said. "When the sun sets, you'll see." I didn't stay to hear more. I ran out of the church and back to my car, determined to leave. But when I started the engine and tried to drive, the car wouldn't move. The tires spun uselessly, as if the ground beneath them had turned to ice. The shadows around me began to shift, growing darker and thicker, swallowing the light. I could feel them watching me, pressing in closer. Panic took over. I grabbed my bag and ran down the road, away from the town, away from the suffocating darkness. But no matter how far I went, the shadows followed. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees twisting and writhing like living things. I don't know how long I ran, hours, maybe. But eventually I collapsed, exhausted and terrified. When I looked up, the sun was rising, and I was standing at the edge of a highway I didn't recognize. Blackwood was gone. I've never gone back, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I feel it, the shadows creeping at the edges of my vision. And in my dreams, I see their eyes, waiting, watching. If you ever get a letter inviting you to a place you've never heard of, burn it. Forget it. Some places are meant to be lost. The memory of Blackwood never truly faded. Even after I returned home, even after I convinced myself it was just some elaborate trick my mind had played on me, the feeling lingered. It was like a weight pressing against the edges of my reality, a knowledge that what I'd seen couldn't be explained or undone. At first, I tried to move on. I threw myself into work, took on stories that kept me busy, kept me traveling. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the unease. Every time I turned a corner or walked into a shadowy room, I felt like something was there, watching, waiting. I started noticing strange things, small at first. My reflection in the mirror would seem a little off, moving a split second after I did. Shadows in my apartment stretched further than they should have, curling along the walls like they had a mind of their own. One night, as I was editing photos from a recent assignment, my computer froze. The screen flickered, and for a brief moment, an image appeared. It wasn't one of my photos. It was the church from Blackwood, its doors wide open, darkness spilling out like a living thing. I yanked the plug from the wall, but even in the sudden darkness of my apartment, I swore I saw glowing eyes staring back at me from the monitor's black screen. It wasn't just my apartment. Everywhere I went, the signs followed. In a crowded coffee shop, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the corner, completely still, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. When I blinked, it was gone. On a train ride through the city, I glanced at the reflection in the window and saw passengers who weren't there. People with hollow faces and burning eyes. I told myself it was stress, or maybe sleep deprivation, but deep down I knew the truth. Blackwood hadn't let me go. Then the nightmares began. Every night, I was back in the forest, running from something I couldn't see. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisting into skeletal hands that reached for my throat. The shadows followed, faster than before, whispering my name in voices that didn't belong to any living thing. In one dream, I found myself in the church again. The old man was there, kneeling at the altar, his back to me. I called out to him, but when he turned, his face was gone, just smooth, pale skin where his features should have been. "They're coming," he said, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "They always come." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. The clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m., and the faint smell of damp wood lingered in the air. I decided to dig deeper. Maybe understanding Blackwood would help me make sense of what was happening. I went to libraries, sifted through archives, searched every corner of the internet. But Blackwood wasn't just obscure, it was erased. The few mentions I found were brief and cryptic. An old census record from the 1800s listed the population as over 400, but every decade after that, the number dropped sharply. By 1972, the population was officially recorded as 0. No explanation, no news reports, just nothing. I tracked down one of the last known residents, a man named Gerald Harlow, who had moved to a nearby town in the late 60s. When I called him, he was hesitant to talk, but I managed to convince him to meet me. We sat in a dimly lit diner, Gerald hunched over his coffee like he was trying to hide from the world. He was in his 80 seconds, with shaky hands and eyes that darted around the room as if he expected something to jump out of the shadows. "Blackwood's gone," he said, his voice barely audible. "It ain't been right for a long time, should have left sooner." "What happened there?" I asked. He shook his head. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me." Gerald sighed, running a hand through what little hair he had left. "It wasn't always bad," he said. "It was just a regular town, once. But then people started disappearing. At first, it was one or two every few years. Folks thought they just left, moved away without telling anyone. But then it got worse. More people, all at once. No one saw them leave, and no one ever found their bodies." He paused, staring into his coffee like it held all the answers he'd spent decades trying to forget. "Then the shadows came," he said. "They'd creep into your house at night, whispering. You couldn't see them, not really, but you could feel them, watching, waiting. They'd take you if you let them." "Take you where?" I asked, my throat dry. Gerald looked up at me, his eyes wide and haunted. "You don't want to know," he said, "and you don't want them to take you. They'll hollow you out, make you part of them, just like the other." I left the diner shaken, but no closer to understanding what Blackwood really was. Gerald had given me a warning, but no answers. The dreams got worse after that. I started waking up with scratches on my arms, dirt under my fingernails, like I'd been running through the woods again. Once I woke up standing in my living room, staring at the front door with my hand on the lock. I knew I couldn't live like this. I needed to end it somehow. So I did the one thing I swore I'd never do. I went back. Finding Blackwood again wasn't easy. The roads I'd taken before seemed to lead nowhere, and my GPS was useless. But after hours of driving, the forest began to close in, and the air grew heavy with that familiar, suffocating stillness. The town looked exactly the same as I remembered. The sagging buildings, the crumbling church, the faded sign at the edge of the road. But this time, there were no people. The streets were empty, the windows dark. The shadows were waiting for me. I stepped out of my car, my heart pounding. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. At the center of town, the shadows began to gather, swirling like smoke, forming shapes that weren't quite human. Their eyes glowed faintly, piercing through the darkness. "You came back," a voice whispered, though it didn't come from any of the figures. It came from everywhere at once. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The shadows shifted, their forms flickering like candle flames. "To feed," they said. I don't remember how I got out of Blackwood that second time. All I know is that when I woke up, I was back in my apartment, my clothes torn and covered in dirt. My camera was gone, my phone smashed, and my car wasn't parked outside. I don't tell people what happened. They wouldn't believe me. But every night, I keep the lights on, and I avoid the shadows as much as I can, because I know they're still out there, watching, waiting. And one day they'll come for me. My name is Claire Thompson, and I'm not one to scare easily. I grew up in a small town, surrounded by forests and farmlands, where every road led to a dead end or a neighbor's house. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where nothing ever happened, or so I thought. It wasn't until one fateful summer that everything I believed about the world was shattered. It all started when my uncle, Mark Thompson, passed away. Uncle Mark had been a solitary man, living on a stretch of land up on Sycamore Hill, far from the town's busy streets. He didn't talk much to anyone, and his house was always the topic of rumors. People said he was strange, that there was something off about him, but I never gave it much thought. He was family, after all, and that meant something, even if I hadn't seen him in years. When his death was announced, my parents were quick to say that I should go up there and help sort out his things. I wasn't thrilled about it. I had no idea what to expect. And to be honest, the idea of sorting through the belongings of a man I hardly knew didn't seem appealing. But my parents insisted, and so, reluctantly, I found myself driving up to Sycamore Hill. The road to Uncle Mark's house was narrow and winding, lined with towering trees that seemed to close in as I drove deeper into the forest. The air was thick with the smell of pine and earth, and the further I went, the more isolated I felt. I couldn't see any other houses, just dense woods stretching for miles in every direction. The kind of place where you could get lost if you weren't. Finally, After what felt like hours, I reached his house. It was an old, weathered cottage, nestled at the base of the hill. The windows were dark, and the front door creaked slightly in the breeze. I hesitated for a moment, standing outside in the quiet, almost unnatural stillness. There was no sound, no birds, no wind rustling the trees, nothing. It was as if the world had stopped moving. I took a deep breath, grabbed my bag, and went inside. The house smelled musty, like it hadn't been lived in for a long time. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners like forgotten memories. The furniture was old, mismatched, and looked like it had been carefully placed but never used. There were bookshelves, stacks of papers, and odd trinkets scattered around, but nothing seemed to have a clear purpose. I wandered through the rooms, trying to get a sense of who my uncle was. There were no family pictures, no personal items that spoke of a life lived. Instead, there were strange artifacts, bones, dried herbs, strange symbols scratched into the wood of the walls. The more I looked, the more unsettled I felt. What kind of person was Uncle? In the back of the house there was a small study with a desk piled high with papers. I sifted through them, looking for anything that might explain the man he had been. One paper, yellowed with age, caught my eye. It was a journal entry, written in my uncle's distinctive handwriting. The words were messy, almost frantic, as though he had written them in a hurry. "I've seen them again. The shadows in the trees. They're getting closer. I can hear their whispers at night, calling my name. I think they want something, but I don't know what. If anyone finds this, tell them to leave Sycamore Hill. It's not safe here. They never leave, not for long." The whirl down my spine. I couldn't make sense of it. What shadows? What was he talking about? I turned the page, but the next entry was even stranger. "I hear them in the walls now. The whispers. They're inside the house. I can't get away from them. The trees are calling me. They want me to come back. I'm scared, Claire. I'm scared." My heart skipped a beat. He had mentioned my name. Was this some kind of warning? I slammed the journal shut, suddenly feeling like the walls were closing in on me. My uncle had been paranoid, yes, but had it really been this bad? Or was there something else going on here, something I didn't understand? I needed answers. I left the study and walked back outside, my mind racing. It was then that I noticed something odd. The trees on the hill behind the house were different. There was a dense cluster of sycamores that seemed to form a circle, as though they had grown in a deliberate pattern. The air around them felt wrong, heavy. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about it felt unnatural. Against my better judgment, I decided to explore. I grabbed a flashlight from the house and made my way toward the trees. The closer I got to the circle of sycamores, the more I felt a sense of dread settle over me. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, covered in thick roots that seemed to pulse beneath the surface, like the earth itself was alive. I stepped into the circle, and the temperature dropped immediately. It was as if the air had thickened, pressing down on me. I shivered, but I couldn't turn back now, not when I was this close. In the center of the circle, there was an old stone well. Its stonework was cracked and covered in moss, and a thick layer of vines clung to its sides. The well was ancient, far older than the house itself. As I approached, I noticed something strange. There was a faint glow coming from within, as though something was emanating from deep inside. I couldn't resist. I crouched down to get a better look, shining my flashlight into the dark, damp depths of the well. What I saw sent a shock of terror through me. At the bottom of the well, there were eyes, dozens of them, all blinking and shifting like they were watching me. I stumbled back in horror, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind screamed at me to run, but something held me in place. I couldn't look away from the eyes, those cold, dark eyes staring back at me from the depths. Suddenly, I heard a voice, soft but clear, like a whisper on the wind. "Come closer." I froze. The voice was my uncle's, the voice I'd only heard in the journal. It was coming from the well, from the shadows within. Without thinking, I backed away, almost tripping over my feet. The ground beneath me shifted, and I looked down to see the roots writhing, moving like serpents beneath the earth. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the uneven ground. The trees seemed to close in behind me, and the air grew thick and suffocating. The whispers followed me, calling my name, echoing in the distance. They were getting closer, growing louder. When I finally reached the house, I slammed the door shut behind me, gasping for breath. My heart raced in my chest and my hands trembled. I couldn't explain what had just happened. I couldn't make sense of it. I spent the rest of the night locked inside, terrified to go back outside. The whispers never stopped. They followed me, reverberating in my mind, growing louder and more insistent. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't. The house seemed to hold me in place, trapping me in its grip. As dawn broke, I made up my mind. I couldn't stay in that place any longer. But as I prepared to leave, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. Through the window, I saw the figure of a man standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me. His face was shadowed, but I knew it was my uncle. Mark Thompson, standing in the woods, calling me. "Come back," the voice whispered again, this time clearer than ever. I slammed the window shut and ran to the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. As I drove away from Sycamore Hill, I kept looking back. The figure was still there, standing in the same spot, waiting for me. I don't know what happened to Uncle Mark. I don't know if he was ever really dead, or if he had become something else. Something tied to the land, to the trees, to the whispers in the woods. But I do know one thing. I'll never return to Sycamore Hill. Some places are better left undisturbed, and some things should never be uncovered. Because the shadows they hide are far darker than you can ever imagine. My name is Thomas, and about 10 years ago, I was working as a freelance photographer. Back then, I traveled a lot, visiting small, out-of-the-way places to capture pictures for travel blogs and magazines. It was good work, but it often took me to places I'd never planned to see. One of those places was Oak Hollow, a town that wasn't on any map I'd ever seen. It started when I was driving through the Appalachian Mountains, trying to get back home to Virginia. My GPS froze, my phone lost signal, and the sun was beginning to set. I figured I'd drive until I found a main road, but instead, I saw an old wooden sign on the side of the road. "Welcome to Oak Hollow, population 317. The place felt like a time capsule. The houses were old but neat, with freshly painted shutters and gardens that looked too perfect to be real. Main Street had just a handful of buildings, a diner, a general store, a post office, and a barber shop. It was quiet, so quiet that it felt wrong. No one was walking around, no cars drove by, and the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I parked my car outside the diner and went in, hoping someone could give me directions back to the highway. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and everyone turned to look at me. There were only 4 or 5 people sitting at the tables, but their eyes followed me like I'd just walked in covered in mud. The place smelled of coffee and fried food, but there was something else underneath it. Something faintly metallic. "Can I help you, stranger?" asked the man behind the counter. He was older, with a thick mustache and a stained white apron. His voice was friendly enough, but his eyes were sharp and watchful. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "I got a little lost. Could you point me back to the highway?" He nodded and grabbed a napkin, drawing a rough map as he spoke. "Take the road back the way you came. About 5 miles, you'll see a turnoff. Follow that, and you'll find your way." "Thanks," I said. But as I turned to leave, the waitress leaned in close. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with dark circles under her eyes. She whispered so softly I almost didn't hear her. "Don't stay after dark." Her words sent a chill through me. I stared at her, but she straightened up and went back to wiping the counter as if she hadn't said a thing. The others in the diner kept watching me, their expressions blank. I should have left right then. I should have listened to her, but curiosity got the better of me. I told myself I'd just explore the town for a little while, take a few photos, and be on my way. Oak Hollow had this eerie, forgotten charm to it, like something out of an old postcard. I wandered down the empty streets, snapping pictures of the old houses, the peeling paint on the post office, and the tangled branches of the oak trees that lined the sidewalks. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows grew longer, stretching unnaturally across the ground. I started noticing things I hadn't seen before. Curtains moving in windows where no one was visible. Doors that were slightly ajar but closed the moment I looked at them. And the whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the longer I listened, the more it sounded like voices. Soft, faint, and just out of reach. I ended up near the edge of town, where an old church stood surrounded by a small graveyard. The place was crumbling, the steeple leaning to one side, and most of the gravestones were worn smooth by time. As I walked among them, the whispers grew louder, like they were coming from beneath the ground. My skin prickled, and I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. That's when I saw the figures. They were standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the fading light. There were at least a dozen of them, their bodies dark and motionless. I couldn't make out any details, but their eyes glowed faintly like embers in a dying fire. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a headstone. "Get out of there," a voice said behind me. I spun around to see the sheriff, a tall man with a weathered face and a badge that looked older than he was. I hadn't heard him approach, but there he was, staring at me like he knew exactly what I'd seen. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "It's not safe." "What are those things?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my arm and steered me toward my car. "Leave now, and don't come back." I didn't need to be told twice. I got in my car and drove, glancing in the rearview mirror as the town faded into the distance. But even as I sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I spent the night at a motel about 20 miles away. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures standing in the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on me. I told myself I'd imagined it, that it was just fatigue or some trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, against every ounce of common sense, I went back. The town was different. The streets were emptier than before, and the air felt heavier, like a storm was coming. The diner was closed, the general store locked, and there was no sign of the sheriff. As I wandered through the streets, I realized I couldn't hear the birds anymore, or the wind, or anything. The silence was suffocating. I ended up back at the church, drawn there by some invisible force. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, and as I stepped into the graveyard, I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the headstones had my name on it, Thomas Grayson. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, my name, my date of birth, but no date of death. "What is this?" I shouted, but no one answered. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and the ground beneath me began to tremble. Shadows gathered at the edge of the graveyard, coalescing into those same figures I'd seen the night before. I turned to run, but the sheriff was there, blocking my path. His face was pale, his eyes empty. "You shouldn't have come back," he said. "They've claimed you now." "Who? What are they?" I demanded, but he just shook his head. "They're the ones who dream," he said, "and now you're part of their dream." The last thing I remember is the ground splitting open beneath my feet, the whispers swallowing me whole. I woke up in my car, parked on the side of the highway. The sun was rising and Oak Hollow was nowhere to be seen. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, but when I checked my camera, the photos were still there. Photos of the town, the church, the graveyard, and the figures. I've spent the last 10 years trying to forget Oak Hollow, but it won't let me. Sometimes I still hear the whispers, faint and distant, like they're calling me back. And on nights when I can't sleep, I swear I see glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. If you ever find yourself driving through the Appalachians and see a sign for Oak Hollow, don't stop. Don't look back. Just keep driving. Some places aren't meant to be found.